And we're going to get started. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We know that you have a lot of really great options to choose from in the agenda. The Men Who Get It panel and the Young Women's Circle just happened, and those are the ones you can see, everybody can see, but when you go into the breakouts, you've got to make some tough decisions. So we appreciate you joining us for the pay equity conversation. It's a really important topic, and I'm surrounded by some really important, influential experts in the subject matter. My name is Jillian Butler. I currently run the Wavemaker Fellowship Program at Rhode Island Commerce, which is the state's economic development agency. And I'm going to just briefly introduce you to our panel today. I really encourage you, if you haven't already, to check out their bios in the R.I.S.E Women's Leadership Conference system, the app itself, details about their backgrounds, some links to conversations and presentations that they've made are included in there, so you can get to know them really well. But 60 minutes has never seemed so short as it is when I'm having a conversation with these ladies, so I want to get working in that space. So first and foremost, I'll start with Gail. Gail is a state senator and policy whiz who has fought tirelessly on behalf of women and families at the State House here in Rhode Island for years. Kelly is a trailblazer in the nonprofit space, providing research, resources, and energy to the discussion around raising women's voices. Vimala is a progressive policy advocate who has made her mark everywhere from Woonsocket to Boston and down to DC and seemingly everywhere in between. And Tracy is our resident HR guru who is bringing creativity, innovation, and strategies to make work, especially for women in today's workplaces. So these introductions are brief, don't do these women justice at all, so please do take a look at their bios. I'm also not going to spend too much time talking because I'm not the expert here. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how we're going to organize the session today. We're going to do a couple things, accomplish a few things in the short time that we have together. So first and foremost, we're going to set the stage. We're going to provide a baseline and share some facts and figures about pay equity in the workplace and challenges that exist today. Then we're going to move to talk a little bit about what's happening, what has happened here in Rhode Island, in DC, nationally. We're going to just see what's out there and what changes have been made, and then also help to identify some changes that can be made in the future. And then lastly, and arguably most importantly, we're going to leave you with some action steps. Often folks who come to conferences leave and there's a lot of information and it can be overwhelming. And so figuring out exactly what you can do, what is actionable, and what thing you can do tonight, tomorrow, next week to take a step forward in the conversation around pay equity is super important. So we're going to end with that. And with that, I'm going to roll right into the conversation. So as I mentioned, I want to just set the stage, make sure that everybody has a general understanding of what are the facts around pay equity and the lack thereof in today's society. And I think I'm going to start with Kelly. And her organization, the Women's Fund of Rhode Island, has done a ton of work in this space, and I'd love to just get acquainted with the subject matter, Kelly.
Sure. So the latest data that does not include this COVID year talks about a gender pay gap, the gap between what women make for holding similar jobs. The latest information from 2019 says that, white women are making 79 cents on the white male dollar. Black women are making 62 cents on the white male dollar. Latinx women are making 54 cents nationwide on the white man's dollar. It's a little bit less in Rhode Island, unfortunately. And American Indian women and Alaska natives are making 57 cents on the white man's dollar. Now, what we know from research is that, unfortunately, that gender pay gap starts right from the get-go when we start working. As we're getting out of school, women start to make less than men, even in the same jobs with the same level of experience. And while many of us do, in fact, go into occupationally segregated tracks, such as caregiving, that patient care, child care, or perhaps teaching, or even retail and hospitality, those places do tend to pay less. But even in other career paths where, again, you have the same experience, the same level of education, et cetera, women are experiencing a broken run. And that broken rung means that from entry level on, they start to make less than men. And there's not an explanation for it through the research, aside from when you're looking at occupational segregation. This is really important to understand because not only is it a pay gap now, but it turns into a wealth gap later. And over the course of a 40-year career, if you are working over 40 years, you as a woman have the potential to lose a significant chunk of money. And as an example, it's anywhere between $600,000 over the course of a lifetime for white women to $1.2 million for a Hispanic Latina woman, lost over the course of a lifetime. That's money that could have been put aside to buy a house, to help fund retirement, to help deal with health issues, that kind of thing. And it goes even beyond that because a lot of the careers that we have, we are not getting the types of benefits that men traditionally might get. So in a lot of the career tracks that I noted, women are not necessarily getting paid sick days, paid family leave, health care, that kind of thing. So even though we're here today to talk about pay, we need to think about the broader implications of what that means.
Yeah, it's a bigger it's a bigger conversation than just pay specifically. Tracy, as our HR representative, I'd love if you could weigh in. I know Kelly covered kind of the demographic, generational, and a woman's experience, but I'd love to hear what you have to add to that from the company's perspective.
Sure. The unique perspective that I actually have and get to have on a daily basis is that I'm able to see all of these laws, right? How do they really affect us as a person, as a people walking into an organization on a daily basis? And how are organizations interpreting these laws? How are they abiding by them? And in my unique situation as a strategist and a consultant, I have the opportunity to work with CEOs and leadership executives of organizations to help them identify and assess, hey, are we perpetuating this, or are we making it better? Are we living this? And is this a type of organization that we're actually building? A lot of my work also involves the negotiating, right? The negotiating of salaries, the negotiating with people, candidates. And what I find most often that when I am offering positions to women of all colors, all races, all backgrounds, we fail to negotiate. Right. And that may be based in a lot of things. It may be cultural, it may be regional, it may be systematic, but we, as to our men counterparts, we just don't ask. And a lot of the times I'm on the other side of the table, like making faces at people saying, just ask me, right? Trying to lead them there because for whatever reason, we're not asking. So a lot of my work is empowering us to make sure that we're asking. The worst thing I'm going to say is no. And then within the organization, I'm actually helping change the organization from the inside out so that we can look like all of these things that we're perpetuating we are.
Yeah. Yeah. And later on in this conversation, we'll get a little bit to the strategies of how to take those steps and how to empower women and what resources exist to take that step. But, we have here's the facts and the figures. And if anyone wants to argue with you, then Kelly can show you all the research to back it up for sure. But Kelly alluded to this a little bit, and I'd love to shift to you, Vimala, just to give your perspective on the differences in how pay equity and that gap impacts ethnic groups disproportionately. How is that something that plays out in the groups that you work with, in the groups that you have conversations with and advocate for? What does that look like for them? What is the reality for them? Just give us a little bit of perspective there.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. And to the organizers of the event, honored to be here, my fellow panelists. Everyone, whether Black, white, or brown, should be able to have a good life in this country. Most of us, no matter what we look like or where we come from, work hard for our communities. We pitch in for our communities and try to make things better for those to come. In 1981, my parents and sister fled the country of Laos to escape political persecution and arrived in Rhode Island as refugees. Just a few days after settling in, my mom, her name is Gong Dian, began working at a factory where she ended up being paid the same minimum wage for the next 35 years. She worked many 16-hour days just to be able to afford to give me and my sister a comfortable life and to send money back home to our family in Laos. And my mom did this all without paid sick leave or vacation. And so I saw the weight of the financial burden take a toll on her emotional and physical health. And disaggregated data indicates that Southeast Asian women, like my mother in the United States, are making an average of 61 cents to the white male dollar. And this pay disparity is hurting their ability to make choices about their bodies, their lives, and their families. The API community is large and diverse, made up of over 50 different ethnicities and speaking over 100 different languages. The diverse experiences of APIs are often lumped together in an attempt to create a cohesive, stereotypical narrative about our communities, leading to stereotypes such as the model minority myth, which assumes high educational attainment and financial success among all APIs. But the model minority myth is not only inaccurate, it hurts our communities by preventing underprivileged and underrepresented APIs from getting the financial and community resources that they need because many assume that our communities are doing well. For instance, educational attainment is not equal across the board. Among the Southeast Asian American community, only 19% of Cambodian women and 20% of Hmong women have a bachelor's degree or higher compared to 44% of white women. Without higher education, API women find it more difficult to secure high-paying jobs and benefits. Many are also overrepresented in service and personal care occupations, including manicurists, hairstylists, childcare workers, and personal care aides. These are all jobs that often have long hours, low wages, and few, if any, benefits, and expose women to a multitude of physical and health risks. Without equal pay for many women of color, including Southeast Asian women, they'll continue to struggle to afford to pay for their most basic needs, such as paying rent, sending their children to preschool, or being able to afford reproductive health care. Low wages also affect their ability to leave abusive relationships, especially ones in which they are financially dependent on their spouse or significant other. So women like my mom would have greatly benefited from equal pay, from paid and paid leave, and it's about time that they get it.
Yeah, which is a perfect segue to talk to Gail. And it kind of transcends, companies can have policy, states can have laws. And so how and what are we doing, and how are we going about what we're doing in Rhode Island to try to codify some of the changes that Vamala wants to see, that we all want to see, so that all women are treated equally, specifically when it comes to pay equity. And then I think a lot of you alluded to the things that are beyond pay equity, a ripple beyond pay equity, and the other parts of the family life and the general community participation that are impacted by a woman's right for fair pay.
Yeah, thank you. And it's so lovely to be here this afternoon with all of you. Listening to Tracy talk about the individual opportunity to negotiate the table, and that is incredibly important and influence corporate practices. But the reality is that alone is never going to change to fully address the gender and racial inequities that we have in this country. We devalue women's work largely because it's come out of caregiving, and that comes from a history of racism and sexism in this country. We're not going to change that only because of corporate behavior, and that's why we turn to our legislatures and to Congress in order to change our laws and address those issues. In 2001, I had this need to be cared for and caregive all at the same time. I was in a freak accident in which the balcony underneath me collapsed, and I fell 16 feet and broke my back and ended up in the hospital and in a back brace, and months and months and months of physical therapy. And within that same amount of time, I became a mom through adoption. And my sister, who I had been visiting at the time that the balcony broke, lives in Montreal, and she was pregnant. And so she and I became parents for the first time within 4 weeks of each other. And our experience vastly differed because of the policies that existed in the societies we were in. And I really initially thought that was like, oh, we didn't plan well enough for this unexpected medical crisis when my husband didn't have enough time to be able to care for me, take time out of work to care for me, and also caregive for a child that was coming later in the year. And then I saw what the difference the policies meant for my sister's career. She lived and works in Montreal, which had 50 weeks of paid job protected leave. She, once she became a parent, childcare, if she wanted to use the robust Quebec childcare system, was $5 a day. She was able to take the time out of her job in order to caregive for me while I needed to be cared for after my own injury. And all of those things have meant a different trajectory in our career paths because she's been able to take time out and stay in the labor force the entire time while still meeting all those issues. So all of these things are so connected together, and it's really connected with changing public policy, not just individual behaviors or corporate individual behaviors. Through the wonderful advocacy of organizations like Women's Fund, Working Families Party, and other groups, Economic Progress Institute came together to advocate for legislation that I had introduced to address the pay gap. This is legislation that would address both gender inequity and racial inequity in pay by eliminating practices like requiring salary history. Nobody should be basing your current wages on what you made last time, particularly because obviously that just builds on each other over the course of a career. And certainly if you step out of the labor force for any period of time, your wages are significantly lower than they would be. So eliminating that practice while at the same time giving capacity for people who have discovered that they are being paid less because of that they're a member of a protected class, to be able to seek legal remedy, and that there would be opportunity for them to do so with some serious consequences for those businesses. Also, that people would be able to openly discuss their salaries, because what we don't realize is that that's actually not, that's, people are all like, oh, hush, hush, we shouldn't talk about that because it's not nice. But the reality is that's what keeps women from earning more, is because we're afraid to ask what our coworkers make, people in the same job level that we're at. We need to know that in order to be able to advocate for the best salary possible.
Cool. Thank you very much. Kelly, I know that the Women's Fund is super involved in a lot of the advocacy efforts, and I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything to what Gail said around the work that's been done in the past few years to advance the women's agenda at the State House.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly there have been advances that have been made locally and nationally for women. Honestly, my big concern is that the advances that we've made are going to disappear in this time of COVID. There is a new report that was put out by McKinsey and Company. It's their annual Women in the Workplace report, updated for 2020. And what they found is that 1 in 4 women are considering downshifting their career or leaving the workplace altogether because of the pressures that COVID have brought to them. Often women work what we call a second shift. So they might be working full-time in their jobs or their career paths, and then they come home and they do 4 hours more per day of housework and childcare than their counterparts do at home. And given the current situation where there's uncertainty about schooling, for example, and needing to be home to care for somebody who may be sick, et cetera, it's putting pressures on women who previously, the fact that many childcare situations have now disappeared. All of these things are causing pressures enough that it's causing women to leave our workplaces, perhaps permanently. It's going to do major harm. It's 1 in 4 who are considering leaving. It's 1 in 3 if you're a mother, and even more so if you are a woman of color, because then in addition, you also are more susceptible to this virus. And so you're being faced with this choice of, Do I go to work and possibly die? Or do, I stay home and be safe? And these are not fair conversations to have. And it lifts up all of the inequities that we see in our workplaces and in our systems across a whole. We cannot afford to lose the ground that we have gained, which is hard fought and hard won. And we still have so much more that we need to do to create perhaps a new normal for our United States going forward, to the point that Gail was making about, gosh, what can we do for paid family leave, paid medical leave? How do we ensure everybody's got medical care? Because, and right now in the US, most of our medical care is tied to workplaces. And if you've lost your job, what does that mean? Just keep this in mind, folks. The DLT, I believe, put out in the last week that in Rhode Island, 25,000 women have left the workforce since COVID hit. What's going to happen to our workplaces going forward?
Yeah. And that's a really great segue for Vamala, both to talk about some of the things that are happening at a national level, but also what does the recovery look like, and how should we design it, and what kinds of things should we be keeping in mind to make sure that we're providing an equal recovery across the board.
Yeah, and thanks to Kelly and Gail for mentioning that poverty is a policy choice, and now more than ever, the virus has shown us that we are dependent on each other. Whether we're Black, white, Latinx, or Asian, Native, or newcomer, we know that it's time to pull together to demand the testing, treatment, and the time off we all need to get and to stay well. The actions of a handful of politicians have pushed poor families and families of color further behind economically and rendered them as much as twice as likely to die from COVID-19. In a recent survey, 61% of Latinx people and 44% of Black people said that they or someone in their household had lost a job or had wages cut due to the coronavirus outbreak, compared with 38% of white people. In a recent report from the National Women's Law Center, we see clearly how COVID-19 has exposed how the work performed primarily by women has long been and continues to be undervalued, even as the rest of the country is depending on it as never before. Women are the majority of workers risking their lives to provide healthcare, childcare, and other essential services, while simultaneously being overrepresented in many of the occupations feeling the brunt of the COVID-19 related job losses. More than half of Latinas and Black women reported a loss of income since March, compared to 41% of white men and 40% of white women. More than 1 in 6 Black women and Latinas reported not having enough food in the past week, making them more than twice as likely to report experiencing food scarcity compared to white men. Among renters, Black women, Latinas, and Asian women were all more likely than white men or white women to report not being current on rent payments. Similarly, among homeowners with mortgages, Asian women, Black women, and Latinas were more likely than white men and or women to report being behind on payments. And so this is pretty bad. This is and so we need a just and equitable recovery from this. We must build back better in the wake of this crisis, so all people can earn a good living, take care of our families, and live with dignity. We can't go back to business as usual, as Kelly mentioned, because business as usual is what caused this crisis. The choices our government makes now to help us weather the outbreak of this virus can also set a better course for the future in our communities, to build better, more secure future for all of us. We must support our families with higher wages, safe workplaces, support for small businesses, paid family leave and sick leave, and guaranteed affordable healthcare for all. So for too long, we've let greedy corporations and the wealthy few rig the rules in their favor so they can pocket the profits and then blame all of our hard times on poor families, on Black people, and immigrants. So we need to join together with people from all walks of life for a better future, just like we won better wages, safer workplaces, and civil rights in our past. That's how we create an economy that serves our needs, where everyone can earn a good living and have a good life. And I mentioned this earlier, but when I was on the school committee in Woonsocket, it was 2009, that the height of the Great Recession. And so tough decisions had to be made that weren't really fair, for students of Woonsocket. I remember having to cut full day kindergarten. I remember having to cut after school programming. And so we need to really get ahead of this recovery before those really tough decisions have to be made again. And so that we're actually centering the needs of those that are most underrepresented in Rhode Island. And so I'm excited to hear what plans the state has for a recovery.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I want to put a pin in the new normal, the state plans for recovery, what that table looks like for you, Gail. But first, I want to go to Tracy, who is on my left again, because I think what Vamala highlighted a little bit too is and Kelly, the new normal. We have an opportunity for a new response, and in a very unique position as an HR consultant, as an HR professional, you're at the table with a lot of folks that are making some of these big decisions and considering how to embrace them in their decision making. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, and we're definitely starting to see and seeing the change that it's creating, may it be positive or negative, right? In my business as a strategist and a consultant, we have started booming since all of the unrest and since COVID, because candidates, people who are seeking jobs from organizations, are starting to hold them accountable to these goals, to equal pay, to rights, to laws. They're asking for things that they need and they demand and they expect. And they're turning down jobs if an organization can't follow up with their lived values. So we're going into organizations and assessing them from an equity standpoint, assessing them from a diversity standpoint, and not just DEI, inclusivity, right? We're looking at accessibility and belongingness, because we can hire someone and say we have a diverse organization, but when they get to the organization and they see no one that looks like them, how long are we going to actually keep them and retain them? So we're helping organizations focus on that fact. And also, one of my jobs, I think it's fun, but it's probably the hardest thing for a CEO to hear me say, is you're not an equitable organization. I have the task of actually performing equity audits. And for organizations who've been in business a long time and have a perceived perception about the way they do business and the way that they present themselves, it's always eye-opening when you can pull back the layers and say, you're not as equitable as you think you are. You're actually inequitable, and here are the risks of that. And here's what the turnover looks like specifically because of that. So it's exciting on that front, but also we can feel the motion and how organizations must have these things in place in order to retain, grow, or even sustain their current operations.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great segue, Gail, to what I believe is your thoughts around the perceived understanding of what we're doing in the state legislature and the reasons why it's been this way, because since the beginning of time and the current status quo and how it's not really serving us. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what that recovery might look like, how that conversation at the table is now, and what it needs to be in order to be effective and efficient as we design this comeback, and how all of that kind of interplays with what's next on your agenda, what's next on the agenda for equity across the board.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that people are going into these interviews, as Tracy's talking about, and really pushing from the inside and using their own voice and their own power in a moment in time of being hired, which feels like you might not even have a lot of power in that room when you're looking for a job. And so much of our self-worth is tied into that. So to be able to use that moment as a way to influence corporate actions is fantastic and inspiring for me. I think the people who realize that they can take that moment of time and actually use their voice in that way most certainly can use their voice in the legislature. Unfortunately, many of the policies that we are talking about have been opposed by the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, the Northern Rhode Island Chamber of Commerce, large corporations in our state, R.I.S.E, have all been the opponents in the state house to paid leave, to paid sick days, to pay equity bills, to wage theft, to raising the minimum wage. everything that we're talking about that is about women's economic security, we see strong organized opposition from the corporate sector. And so being able to push from the inside of the corporate sector to call that out, and then also coming to the State House and lending your voice in advocacy for that. Often that advocacy is really based on a bill. Calling or emailing your representative or senator and asking them for support about a particular bill. But I think it's more than that. We need to just stop focused on just one bill at a time. Often the current legislative structure says, let's tick the box. We did paid leave. That was something nice for the women this year, and doesn't actually look at doesn't take a holistic view of what a society might look like where we're actually striving for gender and racial equity. If you keep that at the center, if you're viewing that as the way that you actually develop a budget, that you develop policy recommendations, you get a whole different idea of where the state could go. And I think that's something, as Vamala talked about, is really about creating a better life for all of us. That's not just, we're not advocating for pay equity because women want to be paid more. We want to see our economy thriving, and we are leaving money on the table when we aren't paying women adequately or equitably. And certainly when women have to step out of the workforce in order to manage other responsibilities or just lose jobs because those jobs don't exist anymore, we are losing money out of our entire economic structure. People don't have the ability to pay rent, buy groceries. All of those things are what keeps our economy going. And so we need to, that is all tied into looking forward into the next couple of budget years in Rhode Island are going to be very intense. And we cannot view them as through measures of austerity. We have to look at them as investments in our state and the people who work here and actually creating a thriving economy. We know from the last recession that the states who did that, like Minnesota, did much better. They did much better very quickly. And so we cannot continue to make the mistakes that we've had in the past that Vamala was talking about, and that recession in which the state really had a chokehold on the cities and made them make very difficult decisions that were unnecessary if we had allocated resources differently.
Yeah. And I think the whole State House gets nervous when we talk recession, but and Kelly mentioned something in the McKinsey article was referenced as a she session. So just think of how much, when you throw a rock into water, the ripples, they go pretty far. So if one thing happens, then another one happens and another one happens, it's not going to be good if people aren't paying attention to the right things, especially as we approach a really, really, really tough budget year at the State House level. And I really applaud the holistic view, both of this conversation, which all of you who are attending have noticed it evolved from pay equity to a general policy stance and perspective on equal access to a lot of different things on the table. But you can't just knock one thing down, especially in this time of so many different variables playing a role. So now I'm just going to transition to action. And I am a couple of years into the government sector. Before I worked in the government sector, I think I went to the State House one time in like third grade for a field trip. Like it wasn't ever my place. Not that I needed to be invited, but I didn't even know I could go if I wasn't working there. So I'd love to understand from each of you what we can do. What steps can we take to advance the agenda of pay equity, paid leave, all of these things we're talking about forward. Because it can, the State House is like what, the second largest dome in North America or something like that. It's intimidating, it's scary. And so going to the State House might not be the solution for everyone, but I'd love to hear what you suggest, I think, for the folks who are tuning in today as to what they could do as a step forward. I'm going to start this way, which is Kelly.
So I'll give a couple of different options. And the first one is just for our audience in general. Tracy talked about the importance of negotiation at the table. In the nonprofit world, and particularly in fundraising, there's this adage that if you don't ask, you don't get. So number one, if you are being presented with a salary, ask, see if there are opportunities to bump that up. And oh, by the way, you don't have to just negotiate for salary. You can negotiate for more vacation time or for funding for schooling or flex time to work around your schedule, et cetera, et cetera. So these are things that you can do for yourself. And I would say every time that you are having a conversation with a prospective employer or about a new position within your current company, you should be negotiating. Don't take the first offer. Secondly, I would say from a workplace perspective, see if you can help to push the needle at the workplace. If you are a manager, if you are a leader, see who's doing those workplace audits that Tracy talked about, and perhaps it's something that you could do to help lift up the conversation. And shameless plug here on the Women's Fund of Rhode Island.org, WFRI.org/research, you will find a gender equity in the workplace toolkit. At the back of the toolkit, there is a list of questions that you can use as a gender equity in the workplace audit. Things for you to think about creating a more gender equitable workplace. And then thirdly, it's about the community as a whole. It's not just about you or your workplace. It's about what are we trying to create as a world. And in that case, I would say it's about voting. It's about supporting people who have the views that you have, who can lift up your voice, not only at the State House, but even your city hall, your school committee, or even across the United States in elections that are going to impact what our Congress looks like. You need to be involved and make sure that your voice is being heard.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. Vamala, I have you next on my screen, and I know that, and if anyone has the opportunity, I think it's the Progressive Congressional Caucus Center. Is that correct?
The Congressional
Something like-
Progressive Caucus Center.
Go to that website and see all the things they work on, and it's a very long menu and it's a very long list. So anyway.
No, thank you for plugging us. We are a infrastructure building organization and based in DC, and so I'm the organizing director there. But currently based in the great city of Woonsocket, Rhode Island. And the CPC Center works to identify and develop solutions to build a more just, equitable, and resilient nation. And so our network approach brings together community leaders, organizers, advocates, unions, policy experts to build people-led, cutting-edge policy. So a couple things that I think people can do, and then just to work a little bit off what Kelly had said, is calling your elected officials, finding out who they are. I was an elected official at one point, and if I received 5 phone calls from parents about school uniforms, I made school uniforms, I paid attention, right? And so your voice does matter, especially at places like the State House too, and your local electeds, because they're not getting that many phone calls. I think someone mentioned someone got 10 phone calls and at the State House and was really concerned about an issue and took it very seriously. And so at the local level, that does make a big difference. And there are great programs that are, like Kelly runs the Women's Policy Institute, that are teaching women about the process, and they're focused on, figuring out what policy they want to push up at the State House, where do they want to put their energy. There's organizations like Common Cause that are giving tours of the State House when it was safe, to learn the behind the scenes, what goes on going up to the gallery, going on the floor. And groups like New Leaders Council that are helping folks to learn about leadership and how to be a progressive leader. So there are plenty of places and resources that you can plug in if you look hard enough. And there are great people on this call that are part of this network that can probably help to lead you there as well. Yeah, and I think the last thing I would say, and I'm not an expert in this, but our organization, our staff recently unionized, and I think that's really important as well, in thinking about how to build worker power, and how to have a stronger voice. And so that is something to consider. I've seen a lot of progressive nonprofits, start to unionize as well, in living our values. So.
Cool. Thank you very much. Gail, you're next on the list. The State House is our house, but What else, what should we be doing? What actions can we take to support a lot of the directives that you are so graciously putting forward?
Yeah, the State House is our house, and it can be intimidating. I believe it's the third largest dome
Third largest,
in the world.
world, there you go.
Freestanding or something. There's some additional word in that sentence. I don't know, but and it's actually very beautiful. So if you haven't been to the State House, you should, when it reopens to the public, definitely come up to look at it. You know, the way we structure our legislative government, it makes it not all that super easy to even engage. And that's why a lot of people have been kind of up before COVID. We were legislating in session Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, starting at 4 p.m. and would have hearings after that at a time where it makes it very difficult for people to even know, are you going to be there for an hour? Are you going to be there for 10 hours? And if you are an hourly shift worker who needs to be able to take a shift off in order to come testify, that's a potential huge demand on your family income. And we need to find better ways to actually make sure people's voices are being heard. And the good news is there's a lot of great advocacy organizations. Women's Fund is one of them. Vimala is actually about to be on a panel in a couple of hours for the Women Project, which is another advocacy organization. Working Families Party, Common Cause, the Latino Policy Institute. There are a whole lot of other groups in which you can join on their mailing list, and they will be happy to tell you when policy issues come up, that bills that they're interested in, and think that might be of interest to you, to come up and be able to share your voice. Even if you can't come to the State House, being able to email your senator or representative is a way that you can make sure that your voice is heard. Phone calls, whatever, it does actually make a significant difference. And one last plug, as Tracy mentioned the idea of going into a corporate environment which you're hired and nobody else in the room looks like you, can be intimidating, and you don't actually want to stay in that work environment is understandable. The same thing happens up at the State House. When I was first elected, almost none of the people who came up, almost none of the corporate lobbyists are women. Almost everybody who is a lobbyist in the building is white. And the legislature was far less people of color, far less women than it is now. That has been changing with every election. And with that has enabled more people to feel more engaged in the process. So not only, you walk into the building and you're seeing more people that look like you. That's really important. It's really important who you're voting for, and being able to connect that up, because those are the people that are making decisions about what policies happen or don't happen in our state.
Yeah. And Tracy, I will put it to you. Gail and Kelly and Vimala, they're all doing a really great job making these, helping to get these laws and these rules and these policies in place. But what does that look like from a corporate perspective? Like, what does that look like in practice? Yeah. And how can someone who is a worker, whether it's an hourly position or a corporate position, how can someone as a worker take an action step forward to advocate for themselves or for others around them on this pay equity issue?
Yeah, when the boots hit the ground, right? And we're living this every day, and we're seeing things that aren't fair and that worry us and concern us, and we don't say anything. So I'm going to challenge everybody to take that risk. Be demanding and be a champion for each other. It's not just about me at the end of the day. It's about everyone else in that organization or any of the organizations that I work within all the time, because I specifically work with CEOs and founders of organizations. I'm usually the only woman, and I'm usually the only woman of color. And so all those things come into play when we start a conversation from the advice they take from me and from the trust they feel in me giving them advice. And many times I'm at the table and I say, I'm not your yes man, and it's not my goal to make you feel comfortable. A lot of times we have to play to man's fragility, right? And recognizing that and being able to communicate through that so that they understand where we're coming from. When you are a minority in a room, you're very aware that you're a minority, right? You're viewing things from that lens. But on the opposite scope, when you're a majority, you often don't see what everyone else sees in the room, because our companies, our organizations follow who we are. If my company is a white male and it's built on a white man's perspective, the values, the things we put into place are usually going to be of a white male's perspective. Mm-hmm. And so you need to hold organizations accountable of, hey, what is your diversity plan? Is there someone at the table speaking for me? I think about all those pictures that we see lately of all of the men sitting in the Oval Office making decisions about women's reproductive rights and no woman in sight. And like Gail said, it takes one person to come into a room for them to say, never considered that. But you have to be fearless in that. That's been my experience. I'm used to being the devil's advocate, as I call it, or showing people, here's the pros and cons of the decision that you're making. Here's the consequence of that and what that looks like. And here's some other options that we have.
Mm-hmm. You could also say you're getting yourself in some good trouble, as our friend said. And I think that there's I shared this story in our first session, and I'll share it again, but I, as a non-governmental person, said no to a kid my age a couple years ago who was running for a local seat in Coventry because I lived in Providence. And I was like, first of all, I'm a struggling 20-something, and I don't know that I have extra money to donate. But even if I did, why would I donate it to you? I don't live there. And Kelly hit it on the head. You know, your voice can matter no matter where you're directing your donations, your support, your information. And so I'm committing today publicly in front of all of you that I will be making donations to races across the country that matter, that means something to me, that means something to me in Rhode Island, because there's representatives and senators who don't represent my beliefs in office. And there are people who will and who do. And Senator Golden has my vote because she's my senator, but she doesn't have to try too hard there. But I think that money, that support, that education can extend past your four walls. And so I'm highlighting that as an opportunity for folks too. If there's people that you know in local races and state races and in national races that are supportive of what you believe in and align with your beliefs, that donation can matter. That support can matter, and that information can matter. So with the countdown on to the election, I think it's important to highlight and also to vote. If you guys caught Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea this morning, that was her big takeaway as well. And then as we're closing out pretty soon, we have a couple minutes left, but I just want to open it up to you guys. I know we lost Amala. She had to run to another meeting, and apparently she's on another panel tonight, so she's got a busy day. Is there anything that we didn't say? Is there anything that you didn't say or that wasn't a part of the conversation that you want to make sure is recorded for posterity or shared with the attendees that are here today?
You know, I think about the fight for the Fair Pay Act that the Women's Fund has been supporting Senator Golden on for the past couple of years. And one of the constructive criticisms that we have gotten is the fact that we haven't had more, particularly women of color, who are sharing their stories with legislators, because they are the ones who are being impacted so much more severely than, frankly, white women. And so I would just say that if you are a woman of color in this audience, and this is something that is important to you, even if you can't come to the State House to testify in person, you can write a personal letter of just sharing your story and how you are impacted by a policy that is not in place, that may prevent you from getting the money that you truly deserve for the work that you are doing. without having avenues to be able to make sure that you are being paid fairly. So you can write those. We call that written testimony. If testimony is a scary word to you, just think of it as, I want to tell my story. I want my voice to be heard. And of course, if you can be up there, if and when the legislature opens for public testimony, seeing faces and connecting face to face with a variety of legislators, whether they are in your neighborhood or just people who are working on this issue, it's important for your voice to be heard.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would want to make sure people leave with is that, what we have talked about is is the intersection of so many policies that are about women's economic security. And when we talk about elections, people are often extremely focused on the presidential election. I mean, understandably, and and also the U.S. Senate races. Now, we have seen in the past few weeks, after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a nomination to the Supreme Court. Not only that the Judge Barrett is the polar opposite of everything that Justice Ginsburg stood for, but the process that has completely made a mockery of open democracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So both of those things are happening at the same time. And what we know is, even if we have a different president in January, we will have somebody on the Supreme Court that for decades will undermine the things that we are all talking about right here. We're talking about gender and racial equity. We're talking about LGBT rights and voting rights, civil rights, even basic access to healthcare through the ACA. All of that is on the line right now in our Supreme Court. And that can feel very disheartening, but there is hope, and that hope is in your state legislatures. So, in Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Senate does the advice and consent of the judiciary. That's incredibly important, that the appointments that we make going forward are even more so take into account that the judiciary is the front line there in Rhode Island. But more importantly is thinking about the laws that we pass and who do we put up in the state house, who are we electing there, to make sure that those laws actually reflect those values. Because those are the people who are going to make the decisions that will block the ability of the Supreme Court to take away your rights. And so we want to make sure that everything that we do from local level up is making sure that your voice is being heard.
Awesome.
And from an internal perspective, something that we've probably all seen and don't pay attention to in the background, if you see something, say something. We can't be afraid to raise our voice for all those reasons that we don't say anything, for all those reasons that we don't ask. I can tell you, more often than not, the answer is yes than it is no. And the things that Kelly has told you to negotiate for, you should. And then you advocate for the same thing and hold companies accountable to delivering those. Because though you need these companies to work, these companies don't work without you.
Mm-hmm. Fair. Good point. We have a question that came in for probably Tracy and Kelly a little bit. That is, how do I start the conversation about what does my coworker in the cube next to me make? How do I have that conversation with that person? How do I start poking at the systematic organization of workers to understand what the layout looks like? How do we start to navigate to understand where we work now so that we can consider if and what actions could be taken down the line?
So first of all, I would like to share that at aauw.org, they have a virtual free salary negotiation workshop that actually goes into some of this. And from time to time, the Women's Fund will also run a workshop using the same curriculum, either live or with a smaller cohort where there's lots of interaction. What I would say, first of all, you don't necessarily have to have that conversation with your coworker, although feel free to do that. You can use tools like salary.com, or if you work in the nonprofit sector, perhaps the Nonprofit Times salary survey. There are salary surveys out there that can help you to pinpoint what a salary range is for someone with the skill set that you have, the educational background that you have, for the city that you live in or want to live in. And you can use that as a tool to help negotiate by going to your employer and saying, hey, I happen to know that I'm worth X, Y, and Z. And here's, by the way, what I've accomplished for you this year. Wouldn't you like to keep me? I use that as a tool to have a conversation. If you are in line for or want to apply for a promotion, that kind of information is going to show that A, you did your homework, and B, you know what you're worth. So you have the potential to go across the street to the competitor and take that skill set. Let's have a discussion about it.
And Tracy will tell you, you also know that it's really expensive for companies to hire new people.
Yes, it is less expensive to keep them. But also to that question, in a lot of organizations, I work a lot with organizations in DC specifically, and we like to call DC Little California because it's definitely going that way. But there's actually a law against not letting someone talk about salary, right? So we're encouraging people to have conversations about salary, but I understand it still can be awkward, especially if it's your friend. So know this little secret: you have a right to ask for an equity audit within an organization. And you don't have to make that about anybody other than yourself. But what it forces the organization to do then is look at everyone in the organization and determine if they are equitable and inequitable and make changes.
Awesome. That's a good thing to have in your back pocket. Another just general question that is very reflective of the times, I think, but like, how the heck is it even a conversation that pay equity doesn't exist? How can people say it's because of this, it's because of that, it's a false narrative? Like, how is that even still a part of what we're talking about? And probably the white men in power that are saying that, but how is that a thing? And not that you guys have the answer or the silver bullet to why it's still a belief out there, but how can some people still defend the fact that they think that it's not a problem?
You know, one of the things I think about is when I first came into the legislature in 2013, and I had been advocating for paid leave for a while in Rhode Island, but that was something I championed in my first year in the legislature. And the Chamber of Commerce was opposing paid leave, saying, I don't even really exactly remember what their opposition talking points were, but I went to somebody who had been working in this world for decades and said, you know, this is what they're saying. And she pulled out a quote from the business sector in the 1920s after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that killed hundreds of women who were trapped in a factory. And they said the exact same thing. I mean, in like 1920s language instead of 2012 language, but it was the exact same message. This will somehow kill business. Well, we know putting in fire escapes does not kill business. So we know that paying women equitably does not kill business. And in fact, it creates a more thriving economy. And frankly, you only have to look to other nations to see how all of these policies working together actually create better economies. If you compare economic growth, this is before COVID, but compare economic growth of those countries to the US economy, you can see this huge gap based on devaluing of women's work that we have in this country. So those are just the same arguments. They're basically used for everything. It's like a top 3 talking points.
It'll kill business.
What you say.
Yeah.
Yes, that and frivolous lawsuits. Somehow, you know, one frivolous lawsuit is going to upend all of the Rhode Island business community. What I would say, there's a stat here that I want to share. The US Department of Labor in 2015, so before COVID, estimated that the 5 million women who are missing from the US workforce for reasons connected to family care resulted in the loss of $500 billion of economic activity each year. And so to this, I say, can we afford not to create a new better? That was before COVID hit. 500 billion missing in economic activity. That means being able to go out and invest in our restaurants, in our business community, buy stuff, you know, all of that. If we're doing the right things for women, we will help to make a much stronger economy overall.
Right. Yeah. And we talked a little bit at the beginning and throughout this whole conversation, you know, it's not just pay equity. It's family stability, it's economic security. It's the fact that a Latina woman will lose $1.2 million in wealth. And is that just in wages? That's missed opportunity for investments. That's missed opportunity for housing. That's everything. That's gross is what it is. So we are approaching the end of our conversation. So I am going to open it up if anybody wants to say anything, but I think for those of you who are attending, thank you for spending your afternoon with us. And to the panel, I know Vimal had to jump off early, but we so appreciate your expertise and your time and your opinions that were shared today. I do, again, encourage you to take a look at all of these lovely ladies' bios in the app. They're doing really great work. There's contact information, there's outreach resources, and I think I speak for all of them when I say they'd be happy to hear from you if you have any follow-up questions. But thank you guys again. I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great afternoon.